The moment my daughter-in-law started treating my Social Security and retirement pension like her personal piggy bank, I stopped being the overly helpful mother-in-law everyone took for granted. I didn't yell. I didn't make a scene. I just quietly went to work. "Just forward your retirement check straight over to us," Evelyn, my daughter-in-law, Chloe, said, sliding a sleek, pastel blue envelope across the cafe table. It was her baby shower. And that sentence spoken casually between 2 bites of strawberry shortcake wasn't a joke. It was a cold, calculated plan. I looked up from the envelope and stared into Chloe's perfectly made-up face. She didn't show a single hint of hesitation. My son, Julian, sat right next to her, staring blankly down at his coffee mug, completely silent, just like he always was whenever his wife took charge. Over the last few weeks, Chloe had been dropping constant hints about how expensive it was to raise a baby in Seattle, and how my little 2-bedroom garden apartment was honestly way too big for a single widow. But this was a whole new level of audacity. The other guests, mostly Chloe's friends, laughed softly, treating it like some charming, quirky family joke. She was talking about my monthly income as if it were already a line item in her own household budget, earmarked for a luxury stroller and a high-end nanny. I felt my heart skip a beat, but I kept my composure. No tears, no raised voice, no drama. I had spent 40 years working as a corporate accountant, and if there was one thing I knew, it was that you deal with numbers using facts, not emotions. I didn't touch the envelope. I just left it sitting there on the white tablecloth, right in the middle of that awkward silence. Great Aunt Clara cleared her throat from the other end of the table. "Chloe, sweetie?" she asked, her voice ringing out loud and clear. "Have you actually signed a lease for Evelyn's apartment yet? Or do you honestly think she's just going to hand over her home and move into a shelter for you?" The mood at the table shifted instantly. The nervous laughter from Chloe's friends died on the spot. Chloe froze. And right then, I knew it was time to take absolute control of my life back. The drive back was heavy with an oppressive silence. Julian was behind the wheel of my old Subaru Outback, while Chloe furiously tapped away on her phone in the passenger seat, completely ignoring me. I sat in the back, staring out the window at the passing Pacific Northwest pines. Lost in thought, they saw me as old, fragile, and most of all, available. In Chloe's mind, I was the perfect, free live-in nanny, someone who would hand over her hard-earned money and spend her golden years scrubbing floors and changing diapers on demand. When we finally pulled up to my building, Julian turned around in his seat. "Mom, Chloe didn't mean it like that," he said in that weak, apologetic voice that had been grating on my nerves lately. "We're just stressed. The rent on the new place is brutal. And everything gets so expensive with a baby. Come on. We're family." "I am family, Julian. But I am not an ATM," I replied, my voice steady and unwavering. I got out of the car without waiting for an answer and walked up to my front door. As I turned the key in the lock and stepped into the familiar warmth of my apartment, I took a deep breath. There on the kitchen counter was the spare key I had given Julian years ago for emergencies. Lately, he and Chloe had been using it more and more to drop in unannounced, treat my pantry like a grocery store, or borrow things. They already viewed my home as an annex of their own. I looked at that key ring and knew exactly where my boundaries needed to be drawn. Tomorrow, a new chapter would begin. No shouting, no lectures, just undeniable actions that left no room for negotiation. Before I went to bed, I hopped online and booked a mobile locksmith for first thing in the morning, at exactly 8 o'clock the next morning. The locksmith was at my door. It took him less than 20 minutes to swap out the deadbolt. As I paid him in cash, a wave of pure relief washed over me. The spare key Julian and Chloe had was now completely useless. It was my very first step toward reclaiming my autonomy. The second the locksmith left, I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. For over a year, I had been automatically transferring $500 a month into my son's savings account to help him get on his feet. On top of that, I was paying the monthly financing for the crossover SUV. They drove a vehicle that was officially registered and titled in my name. I logged into my bank portal, went to my recurring transfers, and deleted them with a few clicks. I also set the auto insurance policy and registration payments for their car to cancel at the end of the month. I didn't feel a single ounce of guilt. This wasn't an act of revenge. It was a logical consequence. If you view my retirement funds as your personal property, you need to learn what it actually costs to cover your own basic survival. Later that afternoon, I heard a key scratching frantically inside my lock. It jingled against the brass, but it wouldn't turn. Then came a sharp, impatient knock. I cracked the door open just a few inches, catching the chain, and looked out at my son's bewildered face. He was holding an empty Tupperware container, looking at me like a confused puppy. "Mom, my key isn't working. Did you change the locks?" he asked, his tone borderline offended, as if I had wrongfully stolen something that belonged to him. "Yes, Julian, I changed the locks," I said calmly. Standing firm in the doorway, I didn't unhook the chain. The days of him treating my home like a walk-in closet were officially over. "But why?" he stammered, shifting uncomfortably from foot to foot. "What if there's an emergency? We need to have access to your place. Plus, Chloe was going to come over today to use your washer and dryer because ours is acting up again." "If there's an emergency, Julian, call 911. And as for the laundry, there is an excellent laundromat 3 blocks away. I'm simply re-establishing some privacy in my own home," I explained, keeping my voice level and firm. I could practically see the gears turning in his head. He wasn't used to this version of me. For years, I had kept my mouth shut and smoothed things over just to keep the peace. "By the way," I added before he could cut in, "I also canceled the monthly $500 allowance and stopped the payments on the SUV today, since Chloe made it clear that you've already budgeted my retirement into your lifestyle. I assume you two are completely self-sufficient now. You'll need to transfer the car title and insurance into your own names by the end of the month, because I've officially withdrawn my financial backing." Julian's face drained of color. He went pale, then flushed to angry red. "Mom, you can't do that. We already spent that money. Chloe is pregnant. She shouldn't be under this kind of stress." "Then you should probably make sure you aren't giving her a reason to be stressed." "Son," I said. I gave him a polite, gentle smile and slowly but firmly closed the door. When my phone started buzzing a minute later, I walked over to the counter and flipped it face down. Over the next 3 days, my phone felt like an active volcano. Chloe tried calling me 6 times, followed by a relentless barrage of text messages. Her tone mutated rapidly, starting with fake maternal concern and dissolving into outright fury. She threw words around like selfish, toxic, and accused me of abandoning your future grandson. I read every single text thoroughly, but I didn't type back a single word. Giving them a response would only give them leverage to drag me into a debate. Instead, I used the sudden peace and quiet to execute my own plans. I called my longtime friend, Martha, who owned a gorgeous little cottage over on the Oregon coast. She rarely used it during the spring months. "Evelyn, you know the door's always open for you," Martha said warmly when I told her I needed a change of scenery. "Come stay for a few months. The ocean air will do you wonders. And honestly, I could really use some help getting the garden ready for the summer." We agreed I would head down in exactly 2 weeks. I wasn't giving up my Seattle apartment, but I planned to lock it down tight. I packed away my valuables, filed my important documents into a fireproof safe, and asked my neighbor, Mrs. Higgins, to watch the place. I gave her explicit instructions under no circumstances was anyone, including my son, allowed inside. She nodded knowingly. She had seen enough of Chloe's entitlement over the holidays to understand exactly what was happening. On Friday evening, Julian appeared outside my living room window, knocking aggressively against the glass. He looked utterly exhausted, with deep, dark circles under his eyes. He held a thick white envelope in his hand, gesturing pleadingly for me to open up. I paused, stood up from my armchair, and slid the window open just a crack. "Mom, please, just listen to me for 1 second." Julian pleaded, his voice raspy against the cool evening breeze. Chloe won't stop crying. The insurance company flagged the car account, and we don't even know how we're going to cover rent and the stroller deposit this month. We miscalculated. Look, I wrote down our entire budget. He tried to force the envelope through the narrow gap in the window. I looked at the paper, but kept my hands at my sides. "Julian, you didn't miscalculate. You just budgeted with money that doesn't belong to you. There's a big difference." "But you have plenty," he cried out, his desperation cracking through his voice. "Your pension and Social Security are more than enough for just one person. And your rent is locked in. Why are you suddenly being so cold to us? We're having your first grandbaby. It isn't cold to ask my adult son to grow up." I told him quietly, "If you are ready to bring a child into this world, you need to be ready to fund his life yourself. My retirement is the result of 40 years of working 9 to 5, not a trust fund for your lifestyle." He slumped, lowering his eyes. "Chloe wants to apologize. She wants us to all sit down this weekend, go over our expenses, and build a combined family budget. She even suggested you could come over 3 days a week to cook and help out around the house so she can go back to work part-time sooner." I almost had to laugh at the sheer audacity of an apology that came with a job description. They still saw me as cheap labor. "I won't be sitting down for any budget meetings. Julian, I've made my own plans for the next few months, and they don't involve managing your household." Julian blinked, completely thrown off. "What plans? You never travel anywhere." "Well, things change," I said simply. I slid the window shut, locked it, and drew the heavy curtains closed. The knocking continued for another minute or two before his footsteps finally faded down the sidewalk. Over the next few days, I packed my bags without any rush. I kept it minimal, a few months' worth of comfortable clothes, my favorite books, and my laptop. I prepped my apartment for a long vacancy, shutting off the main water valve, unplugging every major appliance, and handing Mrs. Higgins the mail key. Higgins. I also paid a visit to my credit union. I moved the bulk of my savings into a new, private account at a completely different bank, one where Julian had absolutely no legacy, signing, privileges, or emergency access. Total financial separation was the only way to permanently dismantle their emotional blackmail. On the night before my departure, I sat in my immaculate, quiet kitchen, sipping a cup of herbal tea. My car was packed, the gas tank was full, and my suitcases were lined up by the front door. Right then, my phone buzzed on the counter. It was a massive text message from Chloe. The anger was entirely gone, replaced by pure, unadulterated panic. She wrote that the dealership was demanding the final title transfer papers for the SUV tomorrow morning, and they desperately needed my signature to avoid a repossession. I read Chloe's text and felt nothing but absolute serenity. They had gambled on the idea that I would cave at the final hour. They genuinely believed my maternal guilt would override my judgment when the financial clock ran out. They were wrong. Instead of texting back, I opened my contacts and called the general manager of the dealership where I had originally financed the vehicle. I kept it strictly business, explaining that I wanted to exercise my right to early payoff and immediately sell the vehicle back to their used inventory department, since I had the liquidity to clear the remaining balance on the spot. The manager was thrilled by the easy transaction. We finalized the paperwork digitally within an hour. I authorized them to dispatch a flatbed tow truck to retrieve the vehicle directly from the curb outside my son's apartment building, first thing in the morning. Utilizing my spare set of keys, it was a clean, mathematical solution without the free SUV. They would have to learn to love the city bus or buy a cheap, sensible used car with their own money. It eliminated a major monthly expense for me and stripped away the final layer of luxury I had been mindlessly subsidizing. At 6 o'clock the next morning, as I loaded my last tote bag into the small rental sedan I had booked for the drive down to Oregon, I watched the dealership's flatbed truck roll past the intersection. I handed the driver the registration documents and the spare key fob. "It's parked right outside number 4B, I told him politely. The driver nodded, hooked up the SUV, and pulled away. Julian and Chloe were undoubtedly still fast asleep, completely oblivious. 2 hours later, with the Seattle skyline fading in my rearview mirror as I headed down I-5, the inevitable call came. It was Julian, and he sounded like he was on the verge of a total meltdown. "Mom, the car is gone. Someone stole the SUV right off the street. We called the police, but they said there's no broken glass or signs of a tow warning. What are we supposed to do? Chloe has an OB/GYN appointment in an hour." I pulled over into a rest area, put the rental car in park, and answered in a calm, measured voice. "The car wasn't stolen. Julian, I paid off the remaining balance and sold it back to the dealership. I told you 2 weeks ago that you needed to put it in your own name. You chose not to. So I handled my property myself." The phone went dead silent for a few agonizing seconds. Then, I heard the unmistakable sound of Chloe snatching the phone out of his hand. "Are you completely out of your mind?" she shrieked into the receiver. "We are stranded here. How could you do this to your own flesh and blood? We are your family." "Chloe," I said, with a cool precision that surprised even myself. "You treated my retirement like it was your personal allowance. You disrespected my home and tried to map out my life for me. Now, you get to experience what it's like to rely entirely on what you can earn yourself. Call an Uber for your appointment." I hung up, powered down the phone entirely, and locked it away in the glove compartment. A deep, physical sense of freedom washed over me. For the first time in a decade, the weight of my grown son's life was entirely off my shoulders. By the time I reached the coast that afternoon, Martha was waiting on the porch with a fresh pot of coffee and a warm hug. The Pacific breeze was sharp and crisp, carrying the thick scent of salt water and cedar. The cottage was perfect, and the garden plot was a blank canvas waiting for the spring bloom. I spent the next 3 months losing track of time. I took miles-long walks along the misty shoreline, caught up on my reading, and rediscovered the luxury of a quiet mind. I only turned my phone on for 10 minutes every evening to check in with Mrs. Higgins. The frantic texts from Julian and Chloe eventually stopped entirely. They had finally realized that their tears and guilt trips no longer held any power over me. At the beginning of the 4th month, a handwritten letter arrived in Martha's mailbox. It was from Julian. The tone was completely different, sober, grounded, and quiet. He told me they had broken their expensive lease and moved into a much more affordable apartment near the transit line, and that he had taken on an evening freelance gig to bring in extra income. He also let me know that Chloe had given birth to a healthy baby boy named Owen. I felt a genuine pang of happiness for them, but I didn't feel any urge to pack my bags and rush back to Seattle. I mailed a nice congratulations card along with a box of practical baby clothes, but I made it very clear in my note that I was extending my stay on the coast indefinitely. Any future relationship we had would be built on my terms, absolute respect for my boundaries, and complete financial independence on theirs. I looked out at the endless gray waves crashing against the Oregon shore and smiled. My life finally belonged to me again.